a young man at this time, but he advised Nelson that if Nelson continued on this path, trying to implement the Victory program, he was going to bankrupt the civilian economy. The civilian economy simply couldn't take this degree of extraction, withdrawal of resources in this effort, and also the timetable on which Nelson was trying to do this was proving highly inefficient and disruptive, and everything had to be slowed down and scaled back. Okay? Now, this became known, this is a term that was hot in the years or the months in question here, that has been lost to history, but this was called the feasibility dispute. Feasibility dispute. Was it feasible to actually implement the Victory program? Of course, the military wanted it. They wanted it all as fast as they could get it. But Kuznets and others kept saying, no, this is going to really contract the civilian economy to a painful degree, and we probably can't get there anyway because it's just these goals are just too outrageous. Now, I can't prove this, but I'm reasonably sure that in Nelson's mind and the minds of people around him, among the things they thought as they engaged in this feasibility dispute was that if we contract the civilian economy too much, and the people on the home front really start to suffer real economic pain because of the nature of the war we're fighting, they might lose their stomach for this whole enterprise. Let's remember, they were deeply isolationist right down to the end of the 1930s, even into 1940, and who's to say that sentiment won't reassert itself if this thing gets to be too painful. In any case, Nelson and his colleagues said, okay, we agree, we have to scale this all back. And they had a showdown meeting in Nelson's office on October 6, 1942. On one side of the table were the military leaders, and on the other side were Donald Nelson and Simon Kuznets, and representing the White House, Vice President Henry Wallace, there to signify that Nelson had Roosevelt's backing. And the civilian leaders, Nelson, Wallace, and so on, faced down the military leaders and won the feasibility dispute. Two very concrete and significant results flowed immediately from that meeting. Okay? Number one, the target date for the event that we know as D-Day, which, as we heard again in the film yesterday, was scheduled for June 5th, actually happened on June 6th, 1944. But in the Victory program, the target date for D-Day, what we know as D-Day, the cross-channel invasion of Northwest Europe, was set for July 1st, 1943, just about a year earlier than it actually happened. So the first decision that flows from the resolution of this so-called feasibility dispute is that the target date for the great amphibious invasion of Normandy, Northwest Europe, is pushed off by a year, from the summer of 1943 to the summer of 1944, okay? 1 full year. The second decision that flowed from that meeting is known in military history circles. It was known at the time by this name, and this name has persisted in the literature. It's called the 90 Division Gamble. Now, what are we talking about here? What's the 90 Divisions about, and what's the gamble? Well, the original plan, the original Victory program plan, called for the mobilization of 215 divisions. It was predicated on certain assumptions about what ground effort would be necessary. As a result of this meeting in October 1942, instead of 215 divisions, the decision is made to ratchet it back to 90 divisions. That leaves 135 divisions of manpower that had originally been scheduled to be taken into the armed forces, leaves them at home to stay on the production lines. Which is why, relative to the size of population, we mobilized a much smaller force than did most of the other major belligerents in the war. 16 million men served during World War II. It's a big absolute number. But relative to population, it's not as much as the Soviets, the Germans, the Japanese, or for that matter, the British. So, why was this 90 division, the reduction of 90 divisions, why was it a gamble? Why was the military nervous about it? Well, the answer to that question takes us to our third city, Stalingrad, and early February 1943. As much as any single battle can be said to be the pivot of World War II, Stalingrad is it. Because that is the place where the German advance into Soviet territory was stopped, where there was a major surrender of 350-some thousand German troops under General Paulus, and the Soviets accept that surrender and pass from defensive warfare to offensive warfare, begin to push the Wehrmacht, the German army, back out of central Russia, back through Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, East Prussia, back to Berlin itself in May of 1945. So Stalingrad is an enormously important turning point in this whole war effort. More importantly for our purposes, Stalingrad confirmed one thing and pretty nearly confirmed the second in the eyes of Churchill and Roosevelt, the Western leaders in the Grand Alliance. It confirmed that the Soviet Red Army would not be defeated on the battlefield, something that was a premise of the victory program, that Blitzkrieg, this enormously innovative and effective German technique of fighting wars, was going to knock out the Russians, the Soviets, the way it had knocked out the Poles and the Dutch and the Norwegians and the French and so on and so forth. And that it would be just Britain and the United States would be the only powers left facing Germany, and therefore we were going to need 215 divisions. Stalingrad made it clear that the Soviets would not be militarily defeated, that in fact they were now poised to pass on to the offensive from the defensive, and that we could therefore scale back our military effort. Okay? It also, so that was a strong confirmation of the viability of the 90 division formula. The second thing that Stalingrad did was it did not completely eliminate, but it substantially laid down to near rest another worry that plagued Churchill and Roosevelt, and that was that the Russians, once they had achieved certain objectives, they were suffering so badly from this war that they would seek a political exit. They would cut a deal with Hitler. The way the original Bolshevik government had cut a deal in 1918 at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Kaiser's Germany, and the way the Stalin regime had cut a deal with the Germans in 1939, the notorious Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, provided for their mutual division of Poland. So the fear that the Russians might, if not go down to military defeat, that they might at some point decide this thing is just so bloody costly that we've got to find a way out, and we'll cut a deal with the Germans and we'll release the roughly 300 divisions that the Germans and their allies had on the Eastern Front for the defense of the English Channel. There were somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 German divisions in the vicinity of the English Channel when D-Day happened. If that had been 320, D-Day would have a very different look than our heroic, triumphant history. So, Stalingrad is, in essence, the Soviet victory at Stalingrad clinched the viability of these earlier American strategic decisions. To fight primarily from the air, strategic air bombing campaign, to field a relatively small ground force, 90 divisions instead of 215, and to delay the opening of the so-called Second Front, the Western Front, an operation we know as D-Day, by a full year. Now, Joseph Stalin had his own way of summarizing this American warfighting pattern. And he put it very cynically, but also very accurately. And he said this more than once to both Churchill and to Roosevelt. And I believe he said it to Roosevelt's and Churchill's face, in fact, at the Tehran conference in 1943. He certainly said it in his correspondence, where I've read it. He said, "It appears the Americans have decided to fight this war with American money and American machines and with Russian men." That's a very cynical way to put it. He was the anger in the comment. You can hear it even to this day, but it's absolutely accurate. The American major contribution to the final victory was not heroism and valor and bravery in the field of battle. There was plenty of that, but the major contribution that the Americans made is the one that Ribbentrop had identified in December of 1941, that Stalin was identifying when he talked about American munitions and American money and Russian men. It was not manpower, but industrial strength, and just this avalanche of so-called production miracle of stuff that the Americans could put into the war effort. Okay, so that's a kind of a summary of how the United States fought the war, and that little tale of three cities, as I say, is just a way to summarize that pattern. But let me just briefly dwell on, by way of conclusion, some of the consequences and implications of this. Let me take an economic view at first, and then close with a reflection on the human dimension of this. Because of the decision that Donald Nelson made to scale back the pursuit of implementing the Victory program, the civilian economy in the United States during wartime, the civilian sector of the economy, actually grew by about 15% during the war. In each of the two countries with whom we were allied in the core of the Grand Alliance, the Soviet Union and Great Britain, in both of those countries, the civilian standard of living in the course of the war contracted by about 30 to 35%. So Russians and Britons had about a third less food, fuel, shelter, clothing, staples.